So, very likely in the next coming weeks or so, we're going to hear a lot about what's going to happen to Labour's plan for its 28 billion pledge to invest in new green technologies and infrastructure here in the UK. Now, let's be clear. This pledge was made prior to all, well, the chaos that, shall we say, unfolded before Liz Truss, when the price of borrowing was extremely lower. So Labour could just make that pledge and go, yes, we're going to borrow this money. But now, because the price of borrowing is a lot higher, you are noticing constantly sustained Tory attacks on this policy. Now, I do think that is a good policy. I do think Starmer should keep it. I think it would be good, but I think we need to go further. I do think we need to be even more ambitious in our targets, in our industries, and thinking how we can develop this even more and further. Because we've talked before, or it's come up before, about the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed in America. This was a multi-billion-dollar package passed by Joe Biden that is being used to do subsidies, to do all kinds of things to build the green technologies and other technologies from the future, not just things in like batteries and energy. It's a whole range of technologies. And one of the big problems is, which we haven't talked about this before, but because this has been passed, it is sucking all those companies, all those technologies, not only away from us, but away from Europe as well. Europe at the moment is also looking at passing its own version of the Inflation Reduction Act, because it is, if you talk to some economists, the US passing the Inflation Reduction Act is actually potentially one of the biggest disruptors since the COVID-19 pandemic economically. And that Inflation Reduction Act is only going to keep on rolling and rolling. And more companies are going to want to be in on the ground level, or realize, oh, actually, it's really good to be over in America. Why stay in the UK? So we've got, I think, I think quite rightly so, that the shadow minister, Jonathan Reynolds, he's the shadow business secretary, has come forward and said, look, we need to be more bold about this. We don't just need to stick to the 28 billion pledge, but we need to be even more bolder when it comes to these. Because if not, we are going to face big problems down the line. Because I've described this before, that we are in a race for the next big sort of industrial change, our industrial changeover. And at the moment, because, thanks to Rishi Sunak, we've basically shot ourselves in the foot with him removing all the green crap, to quote of course, the net zero Tories on this. So effectively, we've got all the other countries, USA, Europe, and many others running ahead of us. Meanwhile, we're just stood still. And that is because of Rishi Sunak basically shooting the UK in the foot. And of course, we are looking at a general election this year. And we need to, I think, really put this forward. I think it is really good that you've got Jonathan Reynolds saying, yeah, we need our own version of the Inflation Reduction Act, because if not, we are going to lose out big time. So it's not just keeping pace with that 28 billion pledge, but to be honest, Starmer could get rid of that and do something else with the Inflation Reduction Act, like offering subsidies, things like that. There's a myriad of things he could do, which you could put into that 28 billion pledge. But there is, again, the main pledge was, of course, about borrowing it. And as we've said before, the big problem is now that the cost of borrowing is a lot higher than it used to be. So I would be fine if Starmer said, you know what, we're going to ramp up to that pledge, like the first and second parliament. That will be fine. But I still think there are other things you could do in and around that. And making people understand that if you do go in this way and what is happening, because I really do think people underestimate what the Inflation Reduction Act is really doing on this. So Reynolds was recently at Davos, and this is what he had to say about Biden's Inflation Reduction Act. He said that Biden's act was probably the most significant disruption to investment capital markets in over 40 years, greater than the impact of the pandemic and the global financial crisis. And we've got to respond to that. We've got to increase our competitiveness. And we've got to understand that there is a huge offer there from the US. So this is one big problem of this. That is that competitiveness that we are now lacking in that companies are saying, why stay here when I could go to the US? Bear in mind, we've already been facing this because of Brexit. So now there's an even bigger pull because of that. And when Europe passes their own version of the Inflation Reduction Act, which is probably, I think, going to be passed, I think, this year. I think maybe. I'm not 100% sure. But that's going to have its own pull factor. Because Europe knows as well they need to pass this as well. Not only just individual European countries, but the EU is looking at doing this as well. Like changing subsidies rules for investing in green infrastructure, green technologies. That's going to have a big impact. And this is what the other thing that he said about the act as well. He said, what's so significant about the Inflation Reduction Act is that they have recognized that if you just do it in the cheapest way, that is going to be Chinese, he said. The act has been a massive disruptor, and it is sucking away from Europe a whole range of exciting companies and technologies. Said we've had the same view as Reeves and on the shadow treasury on this, he said. So this is one of the big things that we have to really focus on, because if we don't, we're really going to be left behind on this. So we do need our own version of the Inflation Reduction Act. Very much so. If we do not, then a whole host of technology jobs and all this are just going to get sucked away, probably either to the US, probably to Europe. And the thing is, you've then got to start from scratch. When we already have a lot of these technology companies here, but now you've got a current government that has said, we're not going to invest in you. And the big problem is with companies, they like to be able to know what's coming. They like to be able to plan. And I think Labour does need to really say, right, we're going to commit to this, but we're also going to do this, this, and this as well, maybe along the lines of like the Inflation Reduction Act, with sort of subsidies in sort of green technologies and etc. That would be good as well. We'd like to see that as well. But this is what we're going to see, and we'll probably find out. Like I say, the deadline for manifesto stuff is meant to be February the 8th, I think it is. So it is very likely afterwards we will start to see, probably in sort of the coming weeks after that, we will start to see a lot more cementing of what the Labour policy is. Because Starmer could do a lot of different stuff. But recognizing now how much we need to really act on this is going to be really vital. Really vital. Because if not, we're going to get left massively behind, and it is going to affect the UK for decades to come. So, as always, thank you very much for watching, and of course, as always, we'll see you all next time.